1968 has been called one of the most turbulent years in modern history, and the events of Thursday evening, April 4th, are firmly rooted in the minds of many.
Well, we were watching TV and the news flash where they said Dr. Martin Luther King has been shot, and everybody panicked, and then they tried to revive him, and they were rushing him to the emergency and doing surgery, and so next thing we knew that he was gone.
I was 16 years old at that time. I'm 66 now, so that was a while back. But of course, we were all affected by that. And, being at that age, really didn't have a good understanding, a strong concept of what he actually stood for. But now I can stand here before you and tell you I know exactly what he died for.
Dr. King will always be relevant in my life. This is overwhelming. Excuse me, being here for the first time. My husband is from Birmingham, Alabama, and I remember his mother and grandmother and so forth talking about marching and being a part of the movement. And so it's an ongoing thing. It will always be an ongoing thing for all people.
So when Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968, I was 9 years old. I remember the tragedy. I remember the heartache, and every day I live, I remember the injustice.
Join us in studio now as we remember the movement, the legacy, and the king. With our guests, Dr. Greg Carr, Chair of the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University, Reverend Dr. Howard John Wesley, pastor of Alfred Street Baptist Church, Howard University law students, Azakai Mola Adamu, and David Opangwade, and Dr. Joyce Ladner, author, sociologist, and former interim president of Howard University.
When I think of Dr. King being killed, I always remember where I was, just as the voices before us. I was sitting in a car waiting for a friend who had just stopped off at his house to go inside to get something to come back, and I was listening to the radio. I was finishing up my my PhD at Washington University of St. Louis. And so that's always been one marker. The other marker was to have taken a photo with him in 1962 when he came to my campus, Tougaloo College in Mississippi. And if I think of that short span of 6 years, 62, where he was, just energetic but kind of calm and chilled out, as they say, to the time when he spoke at his last sermon, when he said that I'm not afraid anymore. Because we have to remember in the compressed period of those 6 years, he had gone through so much, so it's almost, it was a calling for him, but one that he was racing to finish to the end, but probably knew he wouldn't.
I wasn't alive when Dr. King was assassinated, but I was speaking to someone who was a professor at Columbia. She's a white woman, and we had a grief counseling session the morning after Trump was elected. And when she was speaking, yes, it was pretty intense for a lot of people. I don't think I was as surprised or disappointed as some of my coworkers, but what she was saying was the last time that people felt that level of just defeat, as if everything had been taken for them, she said, was in 1968. After King and then Kennedy, people lost a lot of hope. And one thing that she pointed out that I thought was really interesting was, did we make a mistake in putting so much of the hope of so many people and so many people in the freedom struggle movement in one person, so that when he died, a lot of people felt that they lost hope, as if it marked an ending to the movement. She was talking to me about, when we have cases like Eric Gardner, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, should we be focusing so much energy on putting one person or one image as the striking point for the entire movement, such that when there's a failure in that regard, people feel that hope is lost? Because obviously Dr. King was an extraordinary leader, but should his assassination really mark any sort of end in any movement? Was it was it wise for us to pour so much of our hope and have him as the image of the movement?
There's no coordinated central figurehead. Mm-hmm. There's not even a leader. Yeah. As a matter of fact, they tout the fact that we are headless, that we are a movement that continues in different cities, but then there lacks some type of coordination as well. And there's a plus and minus, I think, that comes from both of those. You need a polarizing figure like Dr. King who can step forward in the public eye. Otherwise, it continues to remain this kind of scattered agenda that I think we see that kind of weakens the movement at times when there is no coordinated leadership, but it lives on beyond any one disappointing blow as well.
I think that's important. I also think that when we talk about images, and then when we're speaking about our generation in terms of social media and our ability to share those images, especially when it pertains to police brutality, there's almost a desensitization because of the consistency of the images. It's almost like something that you expect. For Black people, especially in underprivileged communities, I mean, you expect the police to be people that you walk in the opposite direction from. But when you have mass media portraying all of these issues constantly and nothing is being done on a state level, nothing is being done on a federal level to try and address these issues that you obviously had to deal with SNCC years ago, it kind of gives this apprehension to groups who are marginalized but are kind of compartmentalized in terms of being in their sections, whether it be regionally or religiously and so forth. It gives this apprehension towards like having this single leader. And so there is kind of a fear, but I also think that one of the major issues is that we've still got civil rights leaders from your era that are trying to hold the flag up. And it's like, if you are a couple steps away from using a walker, you might want to find somebody to replace you. But nobody's ready to replace people or even invest in people our age who are ready to take the baton. And so there's this, dissonance between generations of active individuals within the community. And then I also think that the agenda has changed quite a bit because there happens to be this sense that we've reached equality, but shouldn't we be moving towards equity?
It's interesting. How do we narrate these things? How do we even create a framework to study them so that we can see the differences and see the similarities? I mean, Dr. Ladner, when you talk about the kind of analysis of King coming from you all as late teens, early 20s, there's a generational tension that you see, and then A. Philip Randolph comes in and says, well, can we just, at the march, can we just tone this down, do this for, but I'm thinking of A. Philip Randolph at that age, nicknamed the old man, he and Du Bois, but I'm also thinking of him in 1925. When J. Edgar Hoover said he was the most dangerous Negro in America as an open socialist. And he stayed the course. But I mean, at a younger age, how is he interpreted? How is he interpreted at an older age? And then all these issues that we see, looking back, was Martin Luther King that central figure? Or when he came, especially after he came out against Vietnam, is he a controversial figure at the moment who is narrated in this outsized space by a narrative that we're not creating? And we're not taking the time to narrate our own stories. I mean, as you were talking about in the March on Washington office in New York, I'm thinking Dorothy Height still has not been introduced in that space in a way where we talk about gender, right? And then you go back to A. Philip Randolph calling off the March on Washington in 1941, and who's standing there like, wait a minute, what are you doing? But Mary McLeod Bethune, and they met on this campus to say, no, well, we're not gonna have a March on Washington. We will have a 3 or 4 day conference where we talk about what we need to do, because Black women, the women's club movement, the Negro Council women are saying we need to do something. And then finally, the other thing that comes to mind immediately in this kind of beginning is the power of media. I mean, what happens when we don't have the Black press as we used to have it? But we do have the ability for everybody to talk at once. But what happens is then we don't have a narrative.
It's not shaped.
It's not shaped. And at the same time, we have Black Lives Matter, which is a hashtag. And then we have the Movement for Black Lives, which is a bunch of people in coalition trying to work together. We were yesterday, David and I were over at David and Azake's stomping grounds, the Howard University School of Law, with two young sisters, Andrea Ritchie and Rukia Lumumba, who are part of the movement for Black Lives. And they're doing, of course, because her father, Chokwe Lumumba, is one of the leading black nationalists, Pan-Africanists in the second half of the 20th century. But what does it look like, Jackson, Mississippi? It's very complicated, but I do think we need to narrate our own story so we can complicate this narrative and come up with different solutions.
That's interesting that you bring that up, because I've worked on a number of campaigns, and when you look at the spending for outreach, even talking about President Obama, he spent millions of dollars in terms of his social media outreach, but a minuscule amount for the African American population. There was just a sense that because of him being the first Black president,
we were automatically going to vote
that we were going to be there. And
it was true.
He got that right.
It wasn't exactly. It wasn't wrong.
And fortunately things worked out, but because there was no investment in that platform and a sense of the older generation that's not tied to social media, you've got all these different messages that are floating around. And there's people to this day, from my parents' generation and a little bit older, who still don't think we've ever had our Black president. Think that we had
I don't think we have either.
Right, a president who was Black, exactly. And it's just interesting that we recognize that there has to be a certain level of patience combined with civil disobedience in order for us to kind of make the marginal steps that we want to towards the goals that we have in mind. But at some point, when is it reasonable for us to say we've done this enough? We need to try something new.
You would be interested. All of you would be interested to know that tomorrow I'm going down to North Carolina tomorrow, because this Nick Legacy project that has we've pulled together as many of our records as we possibly can, and they're online. Anyway, we're having a conference with Movement for Black Lives People, and it will be the second or third we've had. And so we continue to do the same, and none of us have changed very much in the way we think. New methodologies and so on have come. I wonder if we had access to kind of social media today. I'm glad we didn't.
Thank God
you said 6 weeks for the March on Washington.
Yeah.
That's incredible when you think about that.
But we had a telephone, and we had the U.S. mail mimeograph machines that you probably don't even
There
know
were
what
three networks out there.
No, but
ABC,
3 million
NBC,
phones now.
NBC, and CBS.
But not Black radio. Black radio now. What was the station in Atlanta when y'all wanted to do something in SNCC or King needed to do something in SCLC?
I
Y'all
don't
were in the same
remember.
block, weren't you? I mean, you could go up there and everybody listened to the same radio station.
Right.
So I mean, now I would argue that what has happened to Black radio?
But what we did was door-to-door, one-on-one organizing and
Canvassing.
And absolutely, I often wonder, how can the young people who send out a tweet for everybody to congregate tonight at 6 to protest this, like MoveOn.org, and then what do you do with the people afterwards? That's the issue we have. Yeah. If you have to organize, when Ferguson movement occurred, some of the young people who were there as leaders became leaders, had the largest number of Twitter followers. How some of them define leadership to us is just strange.
Event politics.
Right, but suppose the collective they around the country follow up the people who come to the meetings, the rallies, and organize door to door, block by block. That's how you build a movement.
Dr. Carr lamented the presence of Black press, and I know there's been a deauthorization of sources within these generations. One that I think I lament as a pastor is this disconnect between movement and church. And you saw an integral tie with the church as a precursor and a follower after Dr. King came in. Everyone, wants to focus on when Dr. King was present, but how much happened on the front end in churches to coordinate for prayers, for organizational meetings, and then afterwards with the follow through that King wanted to see social action, and it was.
That's why we call him the Lord.
Right, the Lord.
And he would pop in to Albany, Georgia is excellent, and I like Dr. King, but to be critical to look at both sides.
This is good.
He Albany, Georgia, for example, we had SNCC workers there a few years before that movement built up to a point where it began to draw national attention. And then Dr. King went down, and it became much more publicized. He went to jail and so on. And there are some SNCC people today who still remember, you know, the carefully cultivated organization they had built door by door, and sometimes spending months with people to try to finally convince them to go down to register to vote. Because we had nothing we could give them except our honesty.
Yeah.
That's so interesting to me. I mean, my first job out of college, and I went to Grinnell College in Iowa, small liberal arts school, one of a very few, you know, number of people of color there, and ended up working for President Obama's re-election campaign in a different part of Iowa, in Dubuque, Iowa. But what I learned that probably has shifted my whole mentality in terms of how to organize is just how important that investment day to day, hitting those same doors, talking to the same people, familiarizing them with why the issues matter to you on a personal level, and allowing them to relate it back. We miss so many opportunities, number one, to really communicate with each other. It seems as if we're always talking past each other, and some of that is the pandering that we see in our politics. Some
you
of
would have
that
been a good SNCC worker.
Would have loved to have been there with you. But, you know, there is this opportunity for us to build our political capital, to store the kind of volunteerism that's necessary for the movement to kind of, you know, coalesce on a national level. But no one is doing it because there's so much money in that process. And people such as myself who specialize and understand what you need to do door to door are trying to, you know, work behind the scenes to make sure that the right people are getting elected, but we're also missing an opportunity to kind of build this bridge between communities in DC and Baltimore and Chicago and Detroit, all the inner cities that are in somewhat of a recovery mode. I mean, I told you I grew up in DC post-crack epidemic. You know, the overwhelming majority of people that I grew up with are either in jail or dead. And the sad truth is that if they had an opportunity to get a job field organizing, they would have been right there working in their community. They would have been building that political capital, and they probably would have found themselves working in someone's administration. I mean,
you know what? The guys, when we went out on demonstrations, the guys who got out front were the not the SNCC students, but the local guys. The guy off the corner. And they weren't afraid of the police, but they would get out there and protect us.
So how do you deal with that question then of what solution, what's the alchemy of the solutions? In other words, what are the nexuses? I mean, we're talking about, we haven't mentioned it but so far, but of course we're here 50 years after Dr. King is assassinated. He's a victim of state violence.
He was.
And state violence, Dr. King was not an elected official. There's a role for electoral politics. I mean, arguably after the assassination of Dr. King, there's a galvanizing of black movement that empties into electoral politics, the Congressional Black Caucus, then the 72 meeting in Gary, this explosion, Jesse runs for president, lays the foundation for what eventually becomes an Obama kind of vision. But at the same time, Dr. King writes in Where Do We Go From Here, his last book, that we've done the easy part. You know, white people can deal with this question of being impolite to black people and changing those laws. But can white people deal with dismantling white supremacy? No. The answer to that is no. And so, but a lot of our energy has been siphoned off into this reform impulse. And even Dr. King's like, that's not, no. So, but now he's been narrated as some person who empties into Obama, when in fact that's so far from the case. That
this last speech at Riverside Church is what foreshadowed his death. Because he shifted to economic inequality and to international inequality around the world.
And militarism.
Militarism.
Yes, which is left out of his legacy, unfortunately.
Vincent Harding, who was kind of a mentor of mine, did the first draft of the speech. And Vincent was a Quaker, a Mennonite, and he headed the Institute of the Black World when I went to work there for a year. 69, 70. And, you know, they lived in the same neighborhood. You walk from Vincent's house. And our office was in one of the old houses that W.B. Du Bois used to live in. So there was a lot of the history there, but we were too close for it to be real history. You know?
Right, you were making history.
I mean, it later in time became historic. But they had many, many conversations over time, and Dr. King was evolving, because, he more than anyone would understand that what he had been doing, and he was confronting a crisis of faith, with continuing to believe in nonviolence, and yet in Skokie, Illinois, being almost killed. And in '66, when he was down for the Meredith March, they made a slight detour in the march and went down to Neshoba County, Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 2 of my friends were murdered, the 3 civil rights workers. I didn't know the third. I didn't know Andy Goodman. But I knew Mickey Swerner and James Chaney very well. But anyway, the point I'm making is that they made this detour. They went to the courthouse, got on their knees to pray. And one of my friends who was beside Dr. King said, they all kept like one eye open because the sheriff was standing above them. I mean, so what I'm trying to say is that he wasn't crazy. He knew that all of this violence was absolutely real.
He had some patience, though.
Yeah, but what else were you to have?
Right.
Although he wrote why we can't wait.
It was a different time, a different place back then. If you have to think of the context. And one of the things I always used to tell my students is that they could not superimpose, say, contemporary frameworks onto how we lived back then.
Of course.
And so, when you begin to white women started talking about how we were a sexist organization where the men led, and nothing was further from the truth. I was talking to Willie Ricks early last year, and I asked him, I said, Ricks, did you guys try to oppress us? He said, oh, come on. He said, it's like women would have beat you up.
Dr. Ladder, that's a huge issue, though. I mean, this question of gender, and a lot of the scholarship wants to impose that paradigm.
Well, I always push back on it all the time. And it has never made sense because these women were different, They were strong and tough. And the average black woman back then wouldn't allow some man to just push her around for nothing.
Interesting.
Because you're raised to be, as mother always said, get a career so you can learn how to take care of yourself, because you never know when you're going to have to fall back on it.
So what can we learn from that? Oh, I'm sorry.
No.
That's good. You about to say something.
Well, I was going to say that as a young woman growing up in this generation, although I understand that you were there, it does oftentimes feel that black women are left out of the narrative when we're talking about the black freedom struggle movement, as if it's focused on the black man and those issues.
Well,
black
the writers who are doing that. It's not us, because we push back against it. We know what the reality is, but those writers don't come to us to get our story.
Exactly, but that is part of the problem if we continue to allow that to happen.
That's why you got to write the history.
Exactly, which I plan to. And part of that will definitely be the frustration that you can feel when so many of the rallying cries that we look to, Eric Gardner, Trayvon Martin, horrible tragedies, which obviously represent injustices in the system, but we don't see that same passion behind a Rekia Boyd, for example, or a Sandra Bland. And it seems like it's just being pushed by the wayside. As a black woman, it can feel like when you go to the black struggle movement, it's so, no, these are not, women's issues. This is about black people. And then when you go to the white feminist movement, no, this is women's issues. This is not black issues. So it's it feels like, where do we belong?
I can't say just one quick point. We didn't focus on gender at all because the real enemy was white people.
And I remember Anthony Pettin was saying that black women at that time had to choose, black or woman, and they sacrificed gender for race, and saying that we're going to support the racial movement, which is why I'm glad to see now the birth of the womanist movement that says, no, these roads intersect, and they're not mutually exclusive, and we stand at the intersection of woman and black, and we argue from this vantage point, from this perspective. And to my lament as a pastor, I think the church missed that movement and now has missed the sexual identity movement, and we're going to continue to be relegated out of a viable place within those who are the new SNCC, those who are, the fire. We need to make change. And the church's inability to embrace women, the church's inability to embrace LGBTQIA+, I think is absolutely going to kill us in the next few years.
Tell me this, how do you change that? How do you get rid of this old mindset among your deacons, and trustees and others who have the power in the churches.
Wow.
If there hadn't been churches, we wouldn't have been able to have mass meetings in SNCC.
Well, we'd have to continue this one afterwards because that's about a 4-hour conversation.
I know, but you got to.
No, but some of it needs to get on this tape. So people need to see
Yeah,
it.
you got to figure out some way to, even with the younger people who are coming out of college these days or coming out of the communities these days, and with 50 years having passed, I mean, you can't allow. I mean, these people can't continue to be call gay people queer, not queer, but horrible names and so on.
I think it requires some leaders within the church, and prayerfully my name will be on that list when someone looks back 20 years later, who stood boldly in the pulpit and proclaimed what we believe to be true, justice and equality in the church. It takes a reappropriation interpretation of scripture, because that's where people have rooted themselves with a mishermeneutic, I would say.
Is it taught in the divinity schools that way?
Divinity schools are much more liberal than church. Yeah, you
black
can't
ones
go
too?
Huh?
The black ones too?
Now let's go back.
I mean, whenever we have a conversation, I'm thinking about the black ones. I'm not so much worried about our
let's say I would assume that 90% of your professors are much more open and affirming than those who come through the classes. But it's easy to come through seminary, hear a lecture, and not be changed or challenged.
Sure.
Yeah.
You know, and then take your own ism right back into it, and then you're in an environment that endorses and embraces that.
Yeah.
You know, so the people don't want to change, you don't want to change, and then the overwhelming majority of the black church is still homophobic and heterosexist. So you're really ice skating uphill. But I think when you have a few congregations that take that lead and people begin to find their space and place, that's all I can be accountable for. I can't answer for that church or this church, but I can answer for this one that I'm in and try to do the best I can there.
So how do we deal with network? I mean, for example, one of the things I like about the movement for Black Lives, again, distinguishing it from Black Lives Matter concept, is that there's a big tent.
Right.
I mean, I often say, you know, I am for every African who's in harm's way. That's just my general. I mean, I'm for all human beings, but I'm gonna start with black folks. But there are in the black nationalist community, there's the deep kind of suspicion and critique of the gender politics of some of the organizations. They see it almost like a Trojan horse. And on the other end of the spectrum, there's an intolerance that kind of speaks to this notion, well, if you're not embracing me as I am, and also going beyond that to say declare yourself an ally, you're an enemy. But so how do we deal with this nexus of politics? Because I mean, the black church, for example, there's a progressive Progressive Baptist?
Progressive National Baptist.
That had, because Dr. King, you know, had to push back against the elders in the community at the same time.
Against what was his name?
Jackson was it?
J.H. Jackson was president.
J.H. Jackson, right? Yeah. And at the same
Who moved the front of his church from Martin Luther King Drive and got renamed to Chicago.
In Chicago, right? He didn't want to have
my church didn't even have the address of Martin Luther King.
You know, it was horrible. It was awful.
But then you know, back then. But then that question emerges when we say black community. What are we talking about? Pre-integration, well, pre-desegregation. It's more segregated now in some ways than it was 50 years ago, right? But pre-desegregation, there is at least a communal concept. All these leaders came out of black institutions, black churches, black schools. Post-desegregation, the fracturing of black identity has created a thing where the only thing we seem to agree on is that somebody need to get their foot off our neck.
And I think that that's part of the poison of not knowing the exact accurate legacy of Dr. King and all of the other movements that were going on. A lot of black youth are taught the thing that you do is you get your education to get out of your hood. It's not about rebuilding your community. It's about leaving. It's about if you want to be black and successful, you have to act a certain way. Be like Dr. King, not like Malcolm X. Be respectable. Be nonviolent. Make white people comfortable. I think that's a part of the issue when you look. I'm from Yonkers, New York, which is just north of New York City. We're going through gentrification now. I just started seeing white people on my bus and in my apartment building. It's like, oh my goodness. But I realized that a lot of me and the people I grew up with, we wanted to leave. We wanted to get out of there. It wasn't about rebuilding our community, but I don't think that that is what Dr. King and people of your generation were working for. I think that's part of the disconnect. When we talk about the black identity, why are we trying to achieve something that we feel is ultimately separate from blackness? It's the respectability politics issue that is just so pervasive, especially, I don't know if more so, but definitely in our generation.
It drives me mad.
It drives me crazy.
And I think that there's so many of our political leaders or social activists are looking for a platform to kind of propel themselves versus the idea or the movement. There's a selfishness about an opportunity of the limelight that comes with being, you know, out front. Just because you can articulate things better than someone else, or you were in the right space at the wrong time.
What we did, whatever Stokely, mean, we specialized in bringing each other down to size. And we started calling Stokely because he was on TV so often around Black Power. Stokely Starmichael, now you better watch that boy.
Starmichael.
Yeah, I mean, couldn't like the media. Well, there wasn't that much media exposure to begin with.
Yeah.
I remember when in Greenwood in the spring of '63, when I think I saw Dan Rather, who was a very young man, and he's in his 80s now, from CBS. You don't even know who he was. He was a CBS anchor. Oh, you remember him? Okay. And a guy from Newsweek and one from the New York Times, Fleming and I'm forgetting their names now. But those were the media who were around. And that was late. That was like '63. There was nobody around 61, 62, And I might say Marion Barry was with that first group of SNCC people who went into Macomb, into Mississippi in '61 in Macomb after the great debate over whether we should do direct action, as Diane Nash wanted, or do we go into voter registration, Bob Moses. But Marion was one of them. He was chair of SNCC at the time.
That's interesting just to hear the similarities in terms of the debates. Debates that we now see re-emerging, and particularly in Black youth movement. And also see how you were able to deploy that direct action, and to see how Black institutions fed that energy. I mean, when I think of, when you mentioned the churches, of course, I'm thinking again about media. When I think about, CBS or Associated Press, I'm also thinking about the Jackson Advocate, Memphis, Tri-State Defender, Baltimore Afro-American. A lot of what Black folks were getting about what was going on was coming through the Black press.
Right.
And then after Dr. King's assassination, I know when I was 3 years old, Dr. King was killed. I obviously don't remember. But what I do remember growing up with in Nashville were the images in the Black press. Ebony magazine was invaluable. Jet magazine, and then it comes through the 70s, the 80s, you see all the style, the imagery. Then when we finally see this country, particularly capitalism, again, as you said, Pastor Wesley, King identifies capitalism along with militarism and racism. We probably should add sexism now as those triple threats, quadruple threats. You see them realizing there's a market there. And then there's a turn in even the politics of I look at Ebony now on the websites, and I've written for Ebony, or I look at Essence, or I look at television, and you don't see the political thrust of the 70s and 80s. When a Black mayor...
Your generation has to do that. You've got, just as you're re-emerging, you can't, we always say you can't criticize unless you're willing to take the problem on. You have to write the history. I remember, I wanted to go back to you about the women's images. Miss Hamer, Fannie Lou Hamer, used to say, these women liberals I hear when I travel and go places, these women liberals talking about female equality or whatever. She said, I've never been unequal. And I'm always happy to get back home to my husband, who's 6 feet tall. She always raised her arm because she was kind of short. And she'd go on to extol the virtues of Pabst, her husband. And that speaks to a lot of what was going on. The guys in SNCC, we loved like our brothers, Sometimes we dated. A lot of times we dated each other. But the work couldn't interfere with the work. I mean, the cause was first and foremost, always. Young and flighty, flitting around here and there from one project to the other, too. We had fun, too, I might say. We had a lot of fun. We had our dances, our parties. Because because you're in the movement does not mean your other parts of your development stop.
Right. Exactly.
You have to be well-rounded.
Absolutely.
Dr. Carr, you hear me?
Yeah, I do. I don't necessarily follow the advice. I'm kind of lopsided, but I try to round it out.
I wanted to speak to you more about the media issue, because one of the frustrations people of our generation have is that social media, as wide-reaching as it is, the control that you were talking about with being able to publish and edit Ebony and put it directly into people's hands, oftentimes when we put things on the internet, it might be accurate, but by the time it gets to the mainstream media, it's been switched all around. I think that there's the lack of that direct media between Black reporters, journalists, and the Black community. For example, think about all of the tragic gun violence we hear about in Chicago, Detroit, that's been documented on Facebook Live, on social media. But in Miami, when it was, white students who were being documented, that is when it had the real impact. It seems as though we've just lost that. We don't have that control. And that is what we definitely need to find.
It would have been a one-day story, at most a week story.
Because it would be our fault.
When you say lack of control, what do you mean? I'm thinking, for example, there's been a lot of conversation now about the importance of trained journalists. And how now with social media, everybody is a journalist.
Exactly.
When you say control, are you saying at particular points, like do we have people who can absorb all that stuff and then communicate it, and we all look to that crew? Because we can all talk. I mean,
exactly. It's about making sure that people are looking to accurate, credible sources, and then also making sure that by the time it gets to CNN or Fox News, or when it gets to that trending report, for example, who is Trayvon by the time he gets to the cable news network? Is he the 17-year-old kid who was walking through his neighborhood, or was he the thug with the hoodie who got suspended and had THC in his system? They're able to shape and craft it so that even sometimes by the time it gets to Black homes, you don't know the facts.
The Black guy's always going to be
again,
redefined.
So kind of where I lament, my profession, I believe that's one of my calls and responsibility. I believe that's a call of clergy, not exhaustively, but we can't just sit in Bible and shout on Sundays.
Right.
My assignment is to help filter and pull what I believe are these really creator God issues that the membership need to be aware of, and make certain you at least are thinking about certain things as you sit in the sanctuary. We're not just here to shout, and I'm not here to make you think what I think, but you ought to have this on your radar. You ought to be searching for truth on this matter. You ought to be debating this. You ought to be talking to your children about this. And quite frankly, I don't think until the church makes that kind of turn, we're going to find any real relevance. Because for you all coming in to hear Jesus got up from the grave and me shout and holler early Sunday morning, could care less.
Right. But is there, now that's interesting because again, differences and similarities. Clearly, was it Frederick Eichelberger or Reverend Ike? Clearly Reverend Ike was around during that period, but so was C.L. Franklin in Detroit. Right, exactly. So was Y.T. Walker and Sam Proctor. I mean, just to name a couple of the brothers, but I'm thinking, does the pulpit have to be political in order for it to be relevant to the Black community? Because these were very political people, and people say, well, now it's prosperity gospel.
Social gospel.
Social gospel. But nobody was more prosperity gospel than Reverend Ike, and it didn't seem to slow down the social gospel during that period.
You've always had that dichotomy of those, so the different varieties of church. You have this thaumaturgical set that life is bad over here, so let's focus on being prosperous. Let's stay out of that because that comforts, that makes us feel better. But I would argue inherently in the Black church from its inception and its most powerful pulpiteers, both women and men, you cannot find an apolitical pulpit. It just does not exist. It just does not exist.
Interesting.
And I don't think that we necessarily need to have one, but what I do think that we need is competent representatives from each of the groups who are able to speak with each other to find intersections. And that's the major issue that I see for our generation moving forward, is that yes, we definitely need to figure out how to better organize Black people. Number one, we don't know what Black represents anymore because now it's not so titrated to where we feel as if we have a specific sense of what it is to be Black. We're becoming globalized. We're understanding that the world has all kinds of issues that are going on that impact us. We're not just focusing on trying to be able to, have access to the same schools and so forth. We're thinking on another level of getting that pot, getting that bag, getting some money so that we can change our community. But I think that the biggest issue that we have, and some of this comes back to that community organizing and building that political capital, is missing the opportunity to speak to people of different races, religion, financial situations, because usually if you have someone who's able to kind of float, and I'm not saying necessarily like change who you are when you're having conversations with different people, but being able to relate to someone with the way that you're speaking, with the way that you inherently understand where they're coming from with their education level, that's where people are missing the ball.
You should have met Medgar Evers.
I wish I could have.
He was my mentor.
I mean, I think the real leaders are people who are with the people. Marion Barry. I mean, he would walk up and down the street, and it didn't matter if you were a PhD student or if you
love Marion Barry.
And he could talk to you, and you never felt like it was fake.
Right.
But so much of the posturing that goes on now with community leaders now and young people like us who understandably are seen as having hubris is this lack of ability to relate to people.
Yeah, Marion would have said, "Hey, David, your name's David. So
Yes,
how you
ma'am.
doing?"
I'm well. All right.
He would.
Right.
Come at my office sometime.
And
We
Meg
gotta
Evans
talk.
was
Right.
is similar, huh? I mean,
Oh,
in the sense that he
very much.
connected.
Yeah, because he had been an insurance salesman when he got out of Alcorn College.
Mm-hmm.
Then that was a job he could find, in Mountain Bayou, Mississippi. It's all black town.
C.J. Walker.
Right,
That's it, yeah.
but then what Mega did was he was the only NAACP paid person in the whole state. He drove up and down those small highways, 2-lane highways, late at night, always alone. The bravest person I've ever known in my life. And one day he came on my campus, Jackson State, before I got kicked out. And he found me.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, "I was in Hattiesburg yesterday, and I ran to your mother in the grocery store." I said, "You met my mother?" And he said, "Yeah, she sent this money to you." I think it was $5, but back then, today it would be 25.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, that was the kind of person he was. He'd stop at the grocery store. He'd just talk to people, but he had a soft voice, and he was very, very the tent came in together for him. He what I'm saying is it was a big tent for him. He was a wonderful person.
Is that part of it? This question of authenticity. I mean, people say that about Malcolm as well. I was thinking about the Black Mosque because we were talking about Christianity.
Oh,
I mean,
let me tell you a story, Malcolm's story. The day after the March on Washington, we all went back to the old Statler Hilton, Washington Hilton, Capitol Hilton now, and Malcolm held forth for hours in the lobby. All the media, international media, everybody surrounded him, and he was speaking on the farce on Washington.
That's where he gave the farce on Washington talk.
Yeah, it was
Black
fun.
clowns and white clowns.
And
That's what he said.
I stood there and listened. Yeah.
But you know what, the connectivity between Malcolm and Martin and Bayard and all of them was that they could bring people together. They might have all had a different message or crafted it in a different way to make it relatable to their communities, but they were able to bring their communities together.
That's right.
And this would be an ideal time for the Black church and the Muslim community, especially the Black Muslim community. As a Black Muslim who's not particularly devout, but a proud member of the community,
This is a time.
Not the nation. My family's from West Africa, so we are,
Continental African Islam, which is a huge and growing population.
Right.
Huge and growing population that is now being targeted in this country in ways that the Black community can relate to.
Right.
I think this would be a beautiful time for collaboration because the immigration policy that we see from the president is a very thinly disguised
that man's name.
racist policy. I know, I won't. Alleged president. So that would be a perfect point of collaboration if that is something that I'm sure the Black church would be willing to see this fictional dichotomy that is put in our schools and in the youth's mind between Dr. King and Malcolm X. We know they had far more in common than they had apart. So this would be a great time for us to join together in that capacity.
I'd love to. It takes pastors who don't mind putting immigration out as an issue that involves us. So I've got to get my congregation, when you hear immigrant, don't think some Mexican fella jumping over the board and trying to take a job that you ain't even applying for.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a narrative they put out to divide us.
Exactly right.
And working across the South, it's like, oh, they're taking our jobs. Well, at the end of the day, no one is taking your job, number one. Number two, if you start thinking about that rhetoric in terms of what white people were saying about Black people during Reconstruction, what's the difference?
Right.
Ultimately, everybody's trying to move forth. Everyone thinks that there's this American dream, but I'm convinced it's a facade at this point.
So you mentioned the politics of respectability as something you lament as well. I despise this limited good mentality that I think just creates a selfishness and a me, myself, and I within every population that you can push a fear button on. The pie is only this big. If you let him or her get a slice, you know what's left for you is going to be minimal. So you've got to
People are
fight.
so self-centered, and authenticity was. If you want to get someone to follow you, you got to be real and not posturing and
say that again, please.
But people will not do it. I mean,
and that's the problem with teaching Black youth that you have to speak a certain way or act a certain way to be in these positions. They see so few people in the positions of power, be it politically, economically, that are like them, and it naturally creates a distrust. Because even when I go back to my own community in Yonkers, if people don't know that I'm from there, I get a very different reaction, especially if I'm dressed like this. We need more people to go into these rooms, have a seat at the table, and be themselves, be real. Not that
we did the opposite. We wore overalls.
I know, dungarees.
Yeah.
We were talking about that.
Yes.
Tell us, what was the philosophy behind putting those dungarees on those overalls?
To be able to, you go out into a field on a plantation where people are working and they got overalls on, and I had an overall skirt. No, but we wanted to identify with the local people. And they liked it, I mean.
Of course.
Frank Thomas just put out this book called How to Preach a Dangerous Sermon, and in it he argues, again, looking at church as limited, this idolatrous imagination that we operate out of, that we have mimicked celebrity culture. And so now
Everyone's
the
a
status
celebrity
for me
now.
is
Everyone's
I gotta
a
have a
celebrity.
Bentley, I gotta have a plane,
Yeah.
Right.
I gotta wear custom
Followers.
suits,
Right.
not dungarees, not among the people, but I lead out by example. Let me have my mansion, my car.
Flex.
Right, and then that's what young people will be attracted to. And when I tell you I despise the term celebrity and preacher, and I am leery of preachers that run out in front of cameras.
Well, you know, it's interesting you say that, because in the 50 years since Dr. King was killed, the commodification of Martin King, of course. I mean, some of it is just the politics of what happens.
Started with his sons.
Oh, absolutely. That's what I'm saying. The family becomes, it's a very difficult thing, right? No, but that's part of
I'm
it.
at an age where I don't even speak
No
unless it's
question.
the truth.
But I mean, whether it be Malcolm
I keep it
and Betty.
100 myself at all
Yeah.
times. And what's the point?
But the
right?
reality is, we as individuals, we've been up against institutions with institutional memory and agendas. We've organized, and that's been our bulwark. But when you are assassinated, like Malcolm, and then you're Betty, you got to raise these children, and then Coretta, who's a force in her own. Then sometimes families make choices.
And
Merle Evans, of course. But when the commodification of King leads to, I mean, it's past Super Bowl, right? Where they take his words out of context to sell trucks. But he's criticizing capitalism, which really gets to the point that you raise, Pastor Wesley, on this question of celebrity culture.
Right.
What happens in a culture of sacrifice when it's commodified and turned into the exact opposite thing of what it was? Because now leaders are defined by visibility and celebrity. And I just don't know. I mean, I think about the sacrifices Dr. King made, for example, just thinking about this question of him going beyond America, talking about the World House and then why we can't wait, and then talking about, where do we go from here? Here's King going to Ghana, meeting Nkrumah. Here's King talking about Nelson Mandela. This is a threat to a country that's based on capitalism, and at the same time, it's a threat to a world order where you got these other women and men in other countries who are trying to bring their entire group up. This country sells one message: be successful.
Do you think Trump is a threat to the world order?
Oh, absolutely. But I think he's a clarifying threat in a way. Well, let's ask
People
you.
are awake now.
50 years since King, when
Because his
King
voters were always there.
Right, they were always there, right? You saw him. I mean, he's more ignorant maybe than Bilbo.
Grandchildren, the children.
The granddaddies, huh?
But Trump comes into existence in a way, in the wake of a 50-year period where you have this massive thrust for social justice. Black people are leading it here in this country. It's a pendulum swing. Because what else is happening in 1968? You had the student movements in Europe. You've got the glow. I mean, you've got stuff going on in Latin America, and they try to put their
movements on campus.
Jazz pulling together internationally.
The world order is terrified at that moment.
Yeah.
And they just basically going on a spree of killings all around this. They assassinate
Angry
people in Latin
veterans. We
America.
put drugs in the community.
Exactly. And then what do? You see another response.
COINTELPRO.
COINTELPRO, right? So I mean, so Trump.
And they hounded
I think
so many civil rights activists.
Trump is problematic, though, because initially I was obviously devastated by his election, but then I thought, this is great. This is going to let people know that all of these folks...
I never thought it was great.
Always thought... Look, at least people are aware
word.
now. It was easier to pretend that things were easier under Obama. This is a wake-up call, but now I fear that because there's so much craziness happening all of the time that nothing seems crazy, and we've sort of accepted it, and that is also dangerous.
Dr. Carr, you hit the key. The word there is that sacrifice, and I've oftentimes ask people, when's the last time you were called upon to sacrifice for something greater than your own gain and your own good? And that to me was the danger of this prosperity gospel that took off in the late 80s and 90s, because it was all about accumulation, and it basically Christianized capitalism. And capitalism and the core of Christianity are antithetical to one another. The underside and underbelly of capitalism with this acquisition at the expense of someone else, there are those who would argue that Christianity at its core has a socialist kind of communal aspect that's dangerous to American politics and white supremacy.
And that's what King is preaching.
And pulled out. So to be able to continue to remind people in our worship, in our living, that we are called to sacrifice.
And you do that.
We receive to give.
You all have one of the biggest, if not the biggest, HBCU fairs. And I know it's not just letting sure people have access. You put the money where the mouth is. I mean, giving out scholarships. How do you balance that between people who want to live a good life, want to enjoy their time on the planet, and people who say, I want to see,
It's difficult to ask people to sacrifice when it's actual food on the table. It's not as if we're talking about rich people cutting a check, but are you able to tell someone you shouldn't work for this company because of their racist policy? Do we have the infrastructure or the capital to give them resources to pay their bills? I think that sometimes it seems as though you're sitting on a pedestal asking people to do something that you can't support them if in fact they do it.
But what level of espionage can be trained into young leaders that want to go and infiltrate these systems? Because somebody's got to get in there and make a change. And the fact of the matter is,
don't say espionage.
I like the term.
Who said by the door?
I'll say it. I have no fear saying it. Part of the issue is that we have all of these people, and we were talking about the boule and all of that. There are individuals that are plucked by high white society to maintain the order of things in the black community.
But those same guys in the boule, some of them will write the checks for you.
Absolutely, some of them will. Right. But I'm saying, how about the ones who aren't ready to using their space to create a pathway for others who are
everyone
ready?
Won't do it.
They won't.
Yeah. They never have.
They won't. But it's got to be a choice. It's got to be a choice. Are you going to write a check? Are you going to give, some of your time? Are you going to invest in an individual?
You got to figure out how to work with them,
yeah,
and not push them away immediately.
Right.
Yeah. If I have one thing to say today, based on my 74 years of living, it is that you got to go back into the neighborhoods and work with the children, work with the young people. There's no better place to be. I mean, college students are already formed. They're going to make it.
Sixth grade, you're already formed.
Well, exactly. What I'm saying is that students who are in college are going to do okay when they get out of here. But what about those little children in the substandard schools who have no one to look up to beyond their immediate family? Well, they look up to their teachers, and they certainly look up to their, well, let me say, when I wrote my dissertation and then subsequently my first book, I found that all the girls in my study, when I asked them who are your role models, all except one said their mothers were. And so we hear all this stuff about how young people are alienated from their families. They don't care about, parents don't care about their children. Sure. People do care. They just don't have enough to work with. They care deeply about their kids.
They got to keep going.
And that's not determined by social class, at all.
No.
So you need to find your fellow students and take them into a neighborhood in D.C. Come back around this area, go to Shaw, Columbia Heights, and set up a project for some little young boys. They would identify with you. You get a chance to talk to them.
And that speaks to the value of our institution.
You can do a lot more good that way, hour for hour, dollar for dollar, than with working,
with adults.
Yeah. The kids need you.
That's true. It's hard not to romanticize our previous generations, but I think about something Dr. Du Bois wrote shortly before he passed away. And of course, Dr. King was one of the few people who never really abandoned Du Bois. He gave a talk at Johnson C. Smith to some black school teachers just before he left for Africa, and he said, these laws are going to change. The desegregation, that's going to happen. He said, and then when that happens, we're going to have to face the real issue, which is the issue of race and culture. What are we going to be? Are we going to disappear? And it seems to me that as we talk about going into the community, we have a role to play. I mean, this is the only black public television station in the country by HBCU, and all of us are in professions, and our commitment has to be not only to our communities, but to our communities with a level of excellence. I mean, y'all were very young. When I think about the faculties at those black colleges, at Tougaloo and Jackson State, Tennessee State and Fisk.
Because they would get us out of jail. I mean.
Sure, no, but even beyond the politics, I'm thinking about the type of caliber of thinker. Yeah. When we see Martin King, Benjamin Mays lowers the admissions standard at the admissions age at Morehouse to 16 to make sure King and them stay out of World War II. But when you see that, they all wanted to be like Benjamin Mays. Sure. But it wasn't just how he looked; it was his intellect as well.
But they were at at a college, but what do the boys out there who don't get to college?
Well,
like
that's
the
what I'm
kids you
raising.
grew up with.
Right.
Like, how do you keep them off the path to go to jail?
Well, we already talked about all the people in my neighborhood gone.
Right.
You know, they've already been mushed out.
Well, I tell another
we got to go across the river and be right there.
That's true.
We got to go
That's
across
true.
the river and be right there. And part of it is the comfiness of knowing that even though we're going through our individual struggles daily and thinking about this on a high level, we don't have to have that same struggle every day, knowing what we're going to have to eat.
No, not
knowing
at all.
how or whether or not we're going to be able to complete our homework, whether we got paper and pens. I mean, I've been to Cape Town, South Africa, and I saw people in the townships, and other than the edifices that these people were living in here in Southeast, you know, in terms of public housing and so forth, it's the exact same.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the exact same.
Yeah.
Poverty is poverty. And people are ignoring it because they're making it relative to societal standards. And I think that that's our biggest mistake, is that, you know, we're not paying attention to where the dollar can be used the best.
And another thing that I think is important for the youth is just education, and an accurate education, one more akin to what I've heard today than what you might see in your average elementary textbook, so that they understand when you look around your community and you see the difference between your neighborhood and someone else's, the nicer white one, and you see that all of the people in your community look like you. It's important that the youth know there's a reason why. It's not as if everyone around you made choices
Ghetto
that
things just
inevitably,
happen.
exactly, they did not just happen. There's a reason why these circumstances exist, and there is something that you can do to improve your community other than just leaving it.
And the gap here in Washington, for example, is widening. You know,
Oh.
the price of homes in this neighborhood, you know, upward to $1 million.
Yeah.
And the families that are left here who still have a place to live, you know, to what do they aspire? I mean, to what those kids aspire?
That's a good question.
And that's why you got to really go and work with these children.
And let them, like you said, it's not missionary work. It's
No,
not
not
outreach
at all.
work.
No.
We're community, but I mean, oftentimes it's gestured toward like that. I'm, you know, proud of the Howard kids who do alternative spring break now, because there's a sense that you're getting more than you're giving, being in community with people.
Right.
And I think about, like you said, I think about somebody like your friend Vernon Jordan. You know, Vernon Jordan's this towering
My
figure.
friend?
Our friend. We'll say that. Member of the board of
your friend.
trustees. So yeah, you know, we use friend in the broad sense in this, but the reason I'm raising it is because
He's my neighbor.
what he talks about growing up across the street from Morehouse. You know, they knocked those projects down a long time ago.
Yeah.
Carver homes.
Yes.
Yeah.
But he said in the morning they would see these little boys poor. They would see Benjamin Mays walking across campus, and from a distance they would try to walk like him. I mean, there's something about proximity. Even what do they aspire to? When you said that, if we don't go to these communities and just be in community, and we're not necessarily tutoring, or we're not just so that people
Let them
know,
see you.
let them see you and interact. We talk to each other
And bring them on the
be real.
campus.
and bring them
And
on
bring
the
them
campus.
back
Well, I
to
was just
Howard.
about to say, to this day, I don't understand why the DC government doesn't give every kid age 16 a free metro. There's some kids in this school in schools who've never been to this. Who've never been to Van Ness. They've never been. They go to They've just been on the.
I'm packing up my bags. I'm gonna